Hi, Misha here, and thought we would look at the evolution, the development of the Star Destroyer, and also maybe explain why many fans feel like the Star Destroyer was a downgrade from what the Republic, the clone army, used. Now, we've already talked about the Imperial Star Destroyer 1 and 2, comparing it with the Moncaos, so it's really just here for comparison. What we're really going to focus on in this video, the Acclamator-class, also known as the Republic Assault Ship, and the Venator-class, also known as the Republic Cruiser. Now, the Acclamator was not a Star Destroyer technically. It was more of a proto-Star Destroyer, although later on it was kind of retroactively given that honorific. The Venator was probably the first to officially be declared by some as a Star Destroyer, and then it would be codified into the Imperial Star Destroyer. So with that, let's just start talking about the Acclamator. Before we get into the Acclamator itself, specs and everything, I want to talk about models of it. For some reason, this is an overlooked ship. The Titanium series, Hot Wheels, the new Black Titanium series, even for the most part Micro Machines, they all did the Venator, and they all do scads of Imperial Star Destroyers. But virtually none of them have done the Acclamator, the Republic Assault Ship, and I really don't know why. Even the De Agostini line, which even went up to 80 issues and did some non-canon ships, didn't do it. In the Titanium series, they did all kinds of repaints and stuff, didn't do it, and I don't know why. Really, the only ones who've done it seem to be Lego, and Micro Machines did one back in their action fleet. So what did I do just to get one to kind of sit in with the rest of the ships? I actually picked up a game piece here. This is from Star Wars Battles. Luckily, it does scale well with the other ships, and it is painted to some extent, and it has some detail, so it fits in. Unfortunately, it's not die-cast, it's plastic, a polymer. Relatively decent, but it'll do. But I find it really odd that no one does this, because it's a pretty major ship. In fact, this was the first in what would be the Clone Warships, and it was the first that would lead to the Star Destroyers, a Proto-Star Destroyer. Work actually began well before the events of Phantom Menace, say around 36 years before the Battle of Yavin, and initial prototype testing of this vessel would begin right around the time of Phantom Menace, maybe a little after. Meaning by the time of Attack of the Clones, these were ready to go, and several had been delivered already to Camino. These were built by Rathona. Later would be part of Kuwat, or subdivision. So what do we have here? Well, it is a relatively large vessel. It's over 750 meters long, over 450 meters wide, and about 185 meters tall. It has a crew of 700, and its primary role, what it was developed for, was an intergalactic fast troop transport, military transport. It can carry 16,000 soldiers, clones, plus quite a bit of equipment for them. For example, it can carry 320 speeder bikes, and it can carry up to 48 walkers, like the AT-TE, and 36 pieces of artillery, And to do this, it had a very quick, very fast hyperdrive, especially for its era. It was considered a class 0.6. And it had a lot of fuel. In fact, it could go 250,000 light years before refueling, which meant it could do a complete circle around the galaxy, or it could travel from one end to the other and back on one tank of gas, and do it very quickly. To that end, it only had 6 months worth of consumables on board, which is less than most later Star Destroyers that had 2 years, but again, if you're going quickly, it doesn't matter. And for backup, it had a Class 10 hyperdrive, which is fine for that era. It would still get you someplace where you could repair. It had a secondary role of assault ship, hence the name Republic Assault Ship. To that end, it had 12 quad turbo laser turrets mounts, and it had 4 ordnance tubes that could either launch concussion missiles or torpedoes. They're in the bow of the ship here, 4 of them. And for defense, it had 24 light but quick firing lasers, so point defense lasers. It also had a reinforced hull and shielding, and the reactor was buried inside to protect it. It also had another role, secondary or tertiary role, as being a carrier. By default, it could carry 80 low altitude assault transports, lot, 66 of the gunship variety, and 14 of the cargo transport variety. Although acclamators here could be modified into starfighter carriers, able to carry up to 156 of the small V-19 Torrent. They would carry far fewer of the larger starfighters. It has a total of 4 engines in the back, kind of starting the Star Destroyer trend. 2 large and 2 kind of secondary smaller engines. It could get up to 1,200 miles per hour in atmosphere, so quite a bit faster than a Star Destroyer could. It does have a lot of the command facilities on this tower up here, kind of more of a bullet shape that would later evolve into the Star Destroyer. It has a large opening bay on the bottom to deploy the gunships, or it could easily land and open up a big ramp to deploy troops directly on the ground. And it didn't have to land on a prepared area. It could land on anything, sand, swampy, the jungle, even water. So it was very flexible as a landing craft. One of the larger ships that could easily operate from land. So it was a very multi-role craft, and where some multi-role craft really don't work out well, this did. It was the right kind of multi-role craft. Very fast, flexible in a good way, good point defense, decent offense, and good shielding and protection. These were first seen at the Battle of Geonosis, 22 BBY, and they did well. They had a dozen ready to go, and they delivered nearly 200,000 clones that day, plus over 2,000 walkers of different types and many gunships. And were credited with kind of turning the tide of the battle. They could both fight in space to break through the blockade and then land and then take off again. And they were successful enough that the Republic's response was to immediately order 1,000 more, which they were happy to produce and provide. So these were in heavy production throughout the Clone Wars. But after the Clone Wars, about 18 years BBY, production was ended, contracts were over. But the new Empire still had tons of these. And because they were flexible, they were first used in their standard role, being kind of retroactively christened Star Destroyers. And they were deployed more on outlying sectors and used for transport, training craft, even sometimes slaver craft. And as the new Imperial Star Destroyer came along, pushing the Venator to the secondary role, that pushed these out further and further towards the rim, others being retired. But it was a durable ship, so some were still around by the time of the Galactic Civil War. But they were long since considered obsolete. The thing is, should they have been considered that? Maybe not, because the Empire didn't really have a ship that could be operated by so few, just 700, and deliver so many, 16,000, plus equipment for those, and it was fast. The Empire really didn't have another craft that was class 0.6, or have the extended range. But, as new regimes want to do, this was kind of a symbol of the old Republic times, and so, like it or not, it was being phased out in form of new Imperial-looking ships. And kind of bridging the gap, we have our next one here. While Rothana was busy creating and building the Acclamator, Kuwat was designing the Venator. And this was another multi-role ship, but different roles. Whereas the Acclamator was a troop transport, this was a starfighter carrier. Whereas the Acclamator was an assault ship, this was a battleship, an attack cruiser, or a flagship, a command ship. So it was designed differently. And it's quite a bit larger. It's over 1,130 meters long, nearly 550 meters wide, and about 270 meters tall, so dimensionally bigger than the Acclamator in every way. It has a total of 10 engines in the back here, 4 large primary, 2 medium secondary, and 4 small auxiliary. In atmosphere, it can get up to about 975 miles per hour, or kilometers per hour. So the same as the old Imperial, well, all being relative term, the Imperial Star Destroyer. It had a Class 1.0 hyperdrive with a Class 12 backup, so it was slower than the Acclamator. And it had a 60,000 light-year range, so less fuel on board than the Acclamator. But it had 2 years' worth of consumables rather than 6 months. And because of its larger size and everything, it had a larger crew of 7,400. But there was a lot more to do. For its attack role, battleship role, it had 8 heavy dual turbo laser turrets, plus 2 medium dual turbo laser turrets. It also had 4 heavy torpedo launchers and 52 point defense lasers. And for the first time, we see 6 tractor beam emitters, a tractor beam being very important to the later Imperial. For its really primary role of a carrier, it had a lot going on. For example, it had 2 bridges. The one on the starboard side was standard just ship operations. The one on the port side was a dedicated bridge, command and control for starfighters. And it had a very large bay. In fact, it could open up to be as much as a half kilometer long, and this allowed it to launch and retrieve or rearm, refuel its craft, all of them, very rapidly. And it could carry a lot of them because the fighters of the day were pretty small and had folding wings to make them even more compact. It could carry 192 of the V-19 Torrent. Later this would be replaced by the V-Wing. It could also carry 192 of the ETA-2, the Eta-2, once that was available. It could also carry 36 of the ARC 170 reconnaissance ship. Those are pretty big. So pretty good fighter capacity. It could carry some gunships, not as many as the Acclamator, but it could carry about 40 of them. And it had a secondary role as a troop transport. It could carry 2,000 clone troops and about 20 walkers and small vehicles, but that wasn't its primary goal. It had a reinforced hull and reinforced extra strength shielding, which was important when the bay was fully open to deploy the fighters because it was relatively vulnerable. And it was quite a success. Now, the Venator was not available for the Battle of Geonosis, the opening battle of the Clone Wars. It was still undergoing final trials. It would come, a few months later, maybe a half year later, at the Battle of Christophsis. But it would quickly become the mainstay, the backbone of the fleet, sometimes even referred to as the Jedi Cruiser because of how often the Jedi would use these as their flagships. And they would produce these in the thousands. In fact, we saw nearly 1,000 being used at the big battle of Coruscant at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith. And while it wasn't perfect, it was a good vessel. And so production would continue after the Clone Wars, even after the Imperial Star Destroyer came online. They would still continue building these for a few years. And they would continue either building new ones from leftover parts or refurbishing existing ones for about a decade, with the last ones done about 5 years before the Battle of Yavin. By this time, though, the Venator had been kind of subjugated to a secondary role. Training ship, backwater, or as a traffic control ship. Basically a police blockade to detect smugglers. And that's because, while it was more of a Star Destroyer, it didn't quite fit in with the Imperial doctrine. They really weren't looking for ships that had armament to fight other large capital ships and that also could carry tons of fighters. Instead, they wanted the Imperial Star Destroyer that had its perceived attributes. So let's kind of revisit it briefly. So the Imperial Star Destroyer was 1,600 meters long and required a crew, or at least when fully crewed, had 37,000 officers and men, plus could carry nearly 10,000 stormtroopers. It was quite a bit slower, though. It had a Class 2 hyperdrive with a Class 8 backup, so better backup, but slower primary drive. And it could carry 72 TIE fighters, plus shuttles and other landing craft. And it could carry a total of 50 walkers, 30 AT-STs, and 20 AT-ATs. It did have 60 turbo laser batteries and 60 ion cannons, plus 6 to 10 tractor beam emitters. So it was heavily armed in that sense, but its point defense laser system was reduced to essentially 2 batteries, one front, one rear. And this was first introduced in 18 BBY and would take over from the Venator over the next decade or so, and would be produced in the tens of thousands, and would be the backbone, the symbol even of the Empire throughout its reign. But was it really an improvement? Well, let's have some final thoughts. While the Acclamator was certainly a proto-Star Destroyer, and inspired the Star Destroyer, it can easily be argued that it wasn't a true Star Destroyer. While it could fight space battles, its primary focus was on the ground, delivering troops, delivering walkers, what have you. It was extremely fast and relatively easy to produce, and more importantly, could be operated by a crew of only 700, landing on any surface. You get to the Venator, it could actually land, but it usually needed a prepared strip or docking facility, although in an emergency it could just land on the surface. No promises if it could take off again, though. It was getting much more to what a Star Destroyer would be. It had the ability to fight other capital ships. It had the ability to carry, maintain, service, operate, control, coordinate a large amount of starfighters, over 400, if fully loaded up with the small ones. But its ability to support ground offensives was limited. It had some, but yeah. The Star Destroyer. This, while it was being tested at the end of the Clone Wars, was not really designed for the Clone Wars. Funny thing, Palpatine seemed to know when the Clone Wars were going to end. And after acclamators and venators were used to mop up separatist pockets, there was really no fear of massive resistance, either from large starfighter groupings or large capital ships. So what did they need a large ship for? For one thing, work projects. Something to keep people busy. At this time, Rathana was under Kuat, and Kuat was controlled by the Empire. The Star Destroyer was very expensive to build, maintain, and crew, which is kind of what they wanted. In a command economy like that, that can be a benefit. And the fact that it only carried 72 relatively lightly armed and no armored, for all intents and purposes, starfighters was of little consequence considering the enemies they were going up against. On the other hand, it had a better ability to support ground offensives than the Venator, carrying, like I said, nearly 10,000 stormtroopers plus walkers and even a garrison base for them, meaning it could blockade, bombard, even occupy a planet if need be. And it did have a large amount of turbo lasers in case something came up, or again, just intimidation. And that's really what it ended up being. It was a resource hog, but I think it was intended to be one. And it was the most aggressive, stark, and frankly depressing looking ship out of the three, and that was by intent, I have little doubt. But yeah, I just thought it'd be fun to look at the evolution of the Star Destroyer. These two here are from the Hot Wheels. The Black Series, the Titanium, has made them as well, and I think those are probably more detailed, but these are a larger model. And sometimes with the Titaniums, they like to do gimmicks. Like, for example, their Star Destroyer has the little Corellian Corvette that can be lowered and raised in the bay. But the problem with that is it means things get a little wonky. The bay's a little long, and the engines are a little bizarrely done. So sometimes I do prefer these. Sometimes I prefer the others. And I just wish more. I don't know if anyone knows why the Venator, the Acclamator, the assault ship has kind of been overlooked by so many different lines over the last 20 years. Please let me know, because it's a I don't know, it's a curiosity to me, because it was such a big part of the Clone Wars, and it's a neat looking design. It's not weird or ugly, and it's the first of the Star Destroyer look, really. So it just seems odd to me. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, Catch you very soon next time.